Hey everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most fundamental things that we do, or that we actually don't do, as eaters in the modern world, and that's eating animals. Of course, eating animals is nothing new. Humans, as you certainly know by now, can eat nearly anything. And for as long as there have been humans have eaten the flesh and eggs, and then later milk of other animals. But the quantity of animals that we've eaten has skyrocketed over the last century or so, and our consumption of their products is growing at a faster rate than at any other point in human history. The odds are decent that you yourself eat animals or some kind of animal product, and that if you don't do that, that you're making a very clear statement about values that you've probably given a lot of thought to. Given how fraught this question of eating animals is from an ethical standpoint, we could talk about this in just philosophical terms. But the question of eating animals also ties together other concerns, questions of labor, of climate and the environment, and of food justice. And for that reason, I think that thinking about animals and eating animals is a really good way of thinking more broadly about the way that food politics operate in the modern world. So today, let's have a look at the different ways in which we produce and consume animals. Not to be bombastic, but really to know what we're talking about in terms of the cost to those animals and also to human health and the climate. And then let's talk about some of the ways that people have responded to those costs by advancing different ideas of ethical consumerism. And we're going to try to connect this to a bigger problem of how to act ethically in a fraught food market. My goal here isn't really to convince anyone to be a vegetarian or a vegan or a pescatarian or a flexitarian, though I think it's something that everyone who cares about food politics and food justice probably should wrestle with. But instead, I want to just show you the complexity of one of the biggest issues in food and agriculture today. So let's start with the actual ways that we produce meat and animal byproducts. And for the most part, this isn't a really pretty story. Over the last 50 to 100 years, beginning from around the time that Chicago meat packers figured out how to get meat from cows in the Midwest, slaughter it in the Windy City, and then ship it out east, we've moved pretty quickly from small-scale animal agriculture on farms to an intensive type of industrial agriculture that looks a lot more like a factory, and hence that term, factory farm. There's a lot at stake in what we call these farms. In the meat industry itself, the term you're going to hear more often is something like intensive animal farming or industrial livestock production. But I think factory farm actually is a little bit closer to what it is. It's an assembly line for reproducing animals, raising them as quickly as possible, getting the largest amount of meat from them, and killing and packaging them in the most efficient way. There's something actually really amazing about this in terms of a technological feat, but definitely it's also pretty horrifying as well. The system looks a little bit different for each of the major types of animals that we eat, though one thing in common is that animals generally don't reproduce naturally, but are impregnated through different forms of animal husbandry. Their lives begin artificially, and they live pretty artificial and short lives, except for on the most particular and demanding farms. Let's start with pigs. Female pigs are put in gestation crates, and they're locked in place while they're impregnated, and they bear a litter in a pretty depressed and catatonic state. While piglets usually nurse for around 13 weeks, they're generally taken away from their mothers on these farms after only a couple, when they still have a desire to chew. But since they're taken away from their mothers and crowded together, their tails get ripped off so that the pigs don't eat each other's tails. As the pigs grow a little bit bigger, they get castrated, they have their teeth clipped, and then they get their ears notched. In big industrial pig farms, tens of thousands of hogs are raised completely in the dark, usually under a metal roof and on metal slates so that they can defecate into a big open pit below, side by side to one another. Around 113 million pigs are slaughtered this way in the United States every year. Maybe the most immediately concerning fact for us is that these large pig farms are really good breeding grounds for many types of swine flu. And in an era of pandemics, this is something that's causing a lot more concern from the perspective of human health. Cows are a little bit bigger than pigs, so fewer of them are slaughtered each year. It's around 33 million in the United States. Cows get branded with hot irons, they also get castrated, and then they have their tails and their horns cut off. The mothers get separated from their calves more or less right after they're born, and the male calves are generally raised in crates for veal, while the female calves become either dairy cattle or meat cattle. On the feedlots, cattle stand ankle-deep in their own waste, generally outside regardless of the weather. They grow pretty depressed and aggressive, and things are made worse by the fact that they're usually fattened on grain, which cows haven't evolved to eat. They generally live their lives suffering from diarrhea, from ulcers, liver diseases, and weakened immune systems, as well as pretty constant udder infections. Cows have really high mortality rates on these farms, particularly during heat waves. And while a cow has a generally accepted lifespan of around 20 years, your average steak gets killed at around 4 years. Both cows and pigs are generally killed on something called a kill floor, which is like an assembly line in itself for stunning, killing, skinning, dismembering, and butchering an animal. It's grueling and really horrible work for the people who do it. Now, chicken, because of its size and the speed of its growth, probably is the most industrial of all of our industrial foods. American farmers raise nearly 9 billion chickens every year. When chickens are born into the egg industry, they have their nerve-rich beaks sliced off so that they don't peck each other to death. This is kind of common between animals. The broilers that get sold in supermarkets for meat are raised in windowless sheds of 30,000 birds, where they can't move without pushing through a sea of others. The sheds are covered in ammonia, and many birds get respiratory diseases in their lungs or they go blind. Most of these chickens are bred for really fast growth, which means that they can't stand up for that long, or maybe even at all. That means that their short lifespans, around 6 or 7 weeks, might actually be something of a blessing. Life is something worse for egg-laying hens. Hens are underfed, since farmers don't want them to grow up too rapidly. So most live chronically underfed, piled up next to each other, maybe 5 or 6 in a cage. Chickens in this condition often become cannibals. They eat each other, and they'll rub themselves until they're sore and bleeding. These chickens live a little bit longer than chickens that are raised for meat, but they're still generally killed at around 13 months. What you really don't want to be is a male chicken. Since male chickens don't grow fast enough, they're not used for food and they can't be used for eggs, so they're generally just thrown into dumpsters, or they get buried alive, or they get put into wood chippers alongside spent hens. All of the chickens, regardless of sex, who are killed as adults, are usually electrified in a water bath, which has a pretty high failure rate. So no matter how those chickens are born and live, they invariably get a pretty bad death. Then, of course, there's seafood. There's an argument to be made, and maybe a good one, that the larger problems associated with seafood are more about the environment and less about pain or ethics. That might be true, but the scale of industrial aquaculture is really no better than it is for terrestrial animal agriculture. Every year, humans eat around 100 million tons of seafood, and they kill around 17 billion sea creatures. Some of these, of course, are caught wild in the ocean, and others, maybe about a third of our global fish consumption, are raised in fish farms. Fish farms are really crowded spaces. There's 50,000 salmon put, for instance, in a single cage. Shrimp farms have undergone an amazing transformation over the last couple of decades. It used to be that shrimp farms yielded around 450 pounds of shrimp per acre. Now they yield around 90,000 pounds. Again, it's an amazing technological accomplishment with some real costs. None of this is really good news for sea creatures themselves. Salmon suffer from stress, parasites, abrasion, and they swim around in circles all day before they're being starved before they're killed, usually for about 7 to 10 days. Farm shrimp live their lives in a bath of antibiotics, and they're generally sick and anxious before they're brought up to suffocate in the air. Wild-caught fish have better lives, but they're also killed in fairly horrific ways. They generally struggle for a few hours on long lines that stretch up to 75 miles. And when they're hauled onto a ship, they're brought up with pickaxes in their flesh before being clubbed to death or bled out through their gills. It's true that some sea creatures don't appear to feel pain, mostly immobile bivalves, so things like oysters, clams, mussels, and scallops. But fish do feel pain, and it seems increasingly apparent to us that crustaceans do as well, and those are the sea animals that we're actually most likely to dismember or boil alive. Utilitarian philosophers ask us to consider suffering as one of our primary concerns. And philosophers like Peter Singer, author of Animal Liberation, one of the most important texts in the vegetarian and vegan movement, suggest that our goal as humans should be to reduce animal suffering to the extent that it's possible. By that account, almost none of this industrial agriculture would be possible, or really even eating animals at all. We wouldn't rip off our dog or our cat's flesh, most likely, and we probably wouldn't suffocate them to death, So the logic goes, we probably shouldn't do that with a pig or a chicken or a cow, given that they all seem to have similar levels of cognition. But let's say that we didn't care at all for this line of reasoning, and that the suffering of animals just didn't matter to us at all. But there would probably still be reasons for us to be concerned about the rise of modern meat in particular. Let's bracket the question about whether or not meat is good for us. Like all things, it probably is in moderation. A bit of steak, some roasted chicken, many types of fish, all of these things give us nutrition, though red meat in particular seems to be positively correlated with a lot of bad health effects. But it is clear that the way we raise meat in industrial agriculture is bad for humans and also the planet. First, factory farms breed infectious disease. When you have billions of sick animals together, you have overcrowding that's really conducive to wide and rapid transmission of new diseases, like the various bird flus and swine flu epidemics that have emerged from industrial slaughterhouses. COVID-19 doesn't appear to have come from industrial agriculture per se, but nearly all epidemiologists agree that factory farming is providing the conditions for more and more of these pandemics to mutate and emerge. There are also more mundane diseases that come from factory farms. Since antibiotics are in such wide use on factory farms, and the amount has increased exponentially over the last couple of decades, they're great places for producing drug-resistant diseases. E. coli infections also stem from animal manure, and there are more and more cases coming from meat every year. But the biggest consequences for us may be the effect that industrial farms are having on climate and the environment. Rather than forming closed ecological loops like traditional farms might, industrial farms are massive pollutants of the land, air, and sea. Nitrogen and pesticides run off cornfields, shrimp farming ruins millions of acres of coastal land, and raw sewage dumps off animal farms into human waterways. Pigs defecate more than 4 times as much as humans do, and it's really unclear where all that shit should go. And while some of us really worry about the impact of flying and driving on climate change, the livestock sector emits far more greenhouse gases than the transportation sector. Methane and nitrous oxide all basically come off from manure and go straight into the atmosphere. Meat and dairy and egg production contributes much more to climate change than cars, trucks, buses, SUVs, trains, planes, and ships all combined. The average American diet generates more than 1.5 tons more carbon dioxide per person per year than a calorically equivalent vegan diet. And then, of course, there's just that question of efficiency. And it's hard to account for just how inefficient industrial agriculture is. Intensively raised animals are fed mostly corn, which requires chemical fertilizers and pesticides, all of which are made from oil. And the transportation of those animals to slaughterhouses and eventually to the consumer also requires oil. We lose calories by feeding animals grain and eating animals rather than just eating that food directly. It's a similar calculus for water. To produce a pound of beef, American farmers use 1,583 pounds of water. And it's the same for land, too. Forests like the Amazon are raised all around the world to produce beef or to produce soybeans to produce and feed animals. Being around industrial farming in any form appears to be really toxic to humans. Industrial farms force stench and pollution upon local communities, and plant workers suffer intensely from their exposure to the same conditions. Small farmers also can't compete effectively with heavily subsidized factory farms, so it's exponentially more expensive to produce meat under relatively decent conditions. Once you start adding up these costs, the questions of why we should eat meat becomes much more perplexing than the question of why we shouldn't. All right, enough just sketching things out. You already know that many people take themselves out of this complicated equation by just deciding that they're going to abstain from animal products, either partially or completely. The idea of being a vegetarian is really, really old, and it's usually tied up with ideas of animal ethics or sometimes human health and temperance. Even though meat consumption was far less prevalent in the pre-modern world, it was still common enough to warrant vegetarianism as a philosophical stance. The followers of the Greek philosopher Pythagoras in the 6th century BC adhered to a vegetarian diet. And by the 3rd century of the Common Era, there was a popular Greek ethical text circulating called On Abstinence from Animal Food. We've already talked about the ethical traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, but it's clear that vegetarianism could be a political and ethical choice in South Asia by the 3rd century before the Common Era, when the Emperor Ashoka sought to promote it in the Mauryan Empire. Some ancient figures urged partial or seasonal vegetarianism. The Japanese Emperor Tenmu banned people from eating wild animal meat during certain times of the year in the 6th century of the Common Era. And many more recent figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Benjamin Franklin were advocates of a meatless diet, finding the consumption of flesh to be an unacceptable stance for a modern human. By the 1830s, the word vegetarian had been coined and was in pretty wide use, though sometimes European vegetarians still called themselves Pythagoreans after the Greek philosopher. The idea of veganism, or abstaining from all animal products and not just its flesh, that's a little more recent. The English animal rights advocate Donald Watson became a vegetarian at the age of 14 in 1924. And 18 years later, he gave up dairy products too, believing that animals could never really give their products to humans. In November 1944, he coined the term vegan, and he founded a journal by that same name. For nearly 3/4 of a century, that term represented something pretty fringe. But by the second decade of the 20th century, if you're in Western Europe or the United States, and increasingly in other places as well, that's a concept that you may already be familiar with. Now, people who become vegetarians or vegans do so for very different reasons. Generally speaking, it's primarily been concerns of animal welfare that have prompted people to adopt these diets, followed by concerns over human health, and more recently about ecology and the climate. And the way that people become vegetarians also varies quite a bit. Ethical vegetarians are much more likely to report a conversion moment, when they suddenly realize that they just couldn't bear to eat meat ever again because of its ethical costs. Health vegetarians are more interested in their own bodies and the impact that animal consumption have upon them. And they tend to go a little bit more slowly and gradually. They become a vegetarian or a vegan or a pescatarian over time. Now, one puzzle that we should just flag here is that a higher percentage of vegetarians and vegans tend to be women. And that's usually attributed to a mix of factors, including greater concern on average for health and diet, rather than any kind of shared moral belief system. That's something, though, that we're still trying to unpack. Vegetarianism, veganism, these are really good examples of what we might call ethical consumerism or ethical consumption. It's the idea that your consumption decisions are fundamentally political ones, and that you should express your politics through what you buy or what you eat. There's other terms that have come to the fore recently that express similar ideas, things like being a locavore, for example. When it comes to animal eating, there's all sorts of new words in use. Pescatarians eat no meat but do eat fish, and flexitarians, as they've come to call themselves, eat meat but maybe only occasionally, on special occasions, seeking to reduce the harm associated with meat. Now, some people don't use those terms at all, but they still make very particular decisions about the types of meat that they'll eat. They'll seek out pastured or free-range animals or eggs, or dairy. Others are going to avoid certain types of meat. The classic example is rejecting veal, which is usually seen as inhumane because of the way that young male calves are raised. Other folks want to do things like ban foie gras, the goose or duck liver that's made from force-fed birds. There's a big question lurking in the background of these choices, and that's the question of just how effective consumer politics actually are. Certainly, regulation, boycotts, mass consumer action, they all can lead to change. But there's some debate over whether stances like being a vegetarian or a vegan by itself can lead to those changes without further intense political action. On the one hand, it seems hard to protest the injustices of industrial agriculture if you're partaking in it. On the other hand, there's probably more needed than simply abstaining from meat or animal products. In some ways, it seems like we're going to soon reach a crossroads with the rise of cellular agriculture. Fake meats have been part of many cultures and many religious traditions. They've been most thoroughly developed in East Asia, and Chinese Buddhists for centuries have developed reasonably convincing substitutes for many animal products, usually for use during holidays. That technology has picked up, of course, in the 20th century, with new developments in food chemistry and products like soy, pea, and wheat. They can all be made into increasingly plausible versions of chicken and beef, though pork and fish are a little bit harder. But now we've got on the horizon the specter of cellular agriculture. That's actual meat that wouldn't be made from slaughtered animals, but from meat cells which are reproduced in vitro. That technology is moving quickly, and it's throwing the meat industry into an existential panic. They've responded by seeking to regulate this technology or to label it in certain ways or block it. But at the same time, all of these big meat companies are investors in meat substitutes and cellular agriculture, so they're kind of trying to hedge their bets. For now, we just have convincing meat substitutes like the Impossible Burger. But it does seem likely that within a decade, maybe two, we're going to have very decent substitutes for things like fish or steak. And then those who still eat meat are probably going to have to confront a big question. Are they going to eat animals because they like the taste, or because they in fact take pleasure in the suffering of animals? That's not a question we're confronting now, but we should be prepared to do so over the next few decades. A friend of mine and a great scholar literally wrote the book on meat consumption in the United States. So as we touch upon the future of eating animals, I wanted to reach out to someone who's helped us make sense of that past. Joshua Specht is a historian of the United States who teaches at the University of Notre Dame. And his book, Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America, is a prize-winning and best-selling account of the rise of beef on the American dinner table. I reached out to Professor Specht to talk about some of that story. Here's what he had to say.
My name is Josh Specht. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. I'm a historian of industrial beef in the United States, and I wrote this book, Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America. The book basically tries to trace the origins of modern industrial beef and simplify a bit. What I mean by that is low-cost, abundant beef that is centrally produced and distributed all over the United States and the world. So it used to be that your food markets were very local. The meat you were eating came from an animal that was basically raised, lived, died, and was butchered relatively close to where you are. And the other thing about that period, before the mid-19th century, was meat was relatively more expensive because you couldn't realize kind of economies of scale, to simplify it. And the book argues is in the late 19th century in the United States, between about 1865 and 1910, a few different factors come together to ensure cheap and abundant meat. One is the availability of vast quantities of land for ranching in the United States. And this is basically land that's been taken by force from American Indian peoples. The other key part, of course, are railroads to transport this, refrigeration technology to move these things, and a bunch of companies in Chicago figuring out how to very efficiently take apart an animal and sell its meat at a profit. And so basically by 1910, beef is cheap and abundant. So you all have been talking about pork in Cincinnati. And when we talk about the big meatpacking companies that emerged in the late 19th century, you might have heard of some of them like Armour and Company or maybe Swift and Company. They're major pork processors too. But so they get into meat in general. What's crazy today is these meat companies refer themselves not as meat companies, but as protein companies. But we can talk about that later. But they actually do pioneer these things in Cincinnati. And they pioneer things like breaking up, slaughtering, and processing an animal to a bunch of steps, all the things you've covered. They moved to Chicago for a few reasons. Chicago takes over as a transport hub. So for the first time, animals from all across the American West are centralizing in Chicago. And so you just have so many more animals you can deal with and process. The other thing that's key to the story for beef is that people are generally okay with preserved pork, if you think of something like bacon. But beef, people really want fresh. And when you distribute something fresh, imagine keeping it from spoiling in 1890 all the way from Chicago to New York. And so that becomes much more complicated. And so more complicated businesses evolve to deal with that question. And then they become powerful enough that they also take over pork production. And so they learn from the Porkopolis story you're familiar with, and they build on it to become even more complicated because they're dealing now with fresh meat as well. I think race ties into this in a lot of different ways. One, and we won't get into this now, but I just want to flag, there's the whole story of taking American Indian land. And there's a belief there that is a legitimate process because Euro-American ways of controlling and owning and managing land are more legitimate than American Indian ways. But to move into the more kind of the race and food story. So you all, I understand, have talked about this story about kosher butchers and kind of specialty butchers surviving. And that's definitely true. In part because if you're a big meat packer in Chicago, you don't want to develop local knowledge about different communities. You want to produce like a standardized product that works for everyone. So it does turn out that some kosher wholesale distributors get in league with the Chicago processors because Chicago cattle markets are so important. But really, these meat packers are dealing with kind of mass, not specialized cuts. And that is because It wants to appeal broadly to a variety of European immigrants in 19th century America. And the interesting thing about food is when you make a recipe, you bring the food products into your own cultural traditions. So an Italian can buy a cut of meat and cook it and make it their own. A German immigrant can buy a cut and make it their own. And so it's like they produce the standardization that then racial and identity-based questions and traditions can import it into. The other story, though, there's a labor story in meatpacking, and that's that overwhelmingly the employees in meat facilities in Chicago and stockyards are Eastern European and European immigrants. And at times of labor strife, managers and owners will actually play racial dynamics against each other. So the question about the relationship between taste and industrial food is something I thought about a lot as I was writing the book. And to be honest, something I'm not sure I totally have figured out, and I don't know if anyone has, and I've even been thinking about it after the book came out. But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is that what's interesting about meat is that for the people who overwhelmingly made up immigrants and people in the United States at this time, to eat meat was to be successful. Meat was a special occasion. So back in Europe, you might eat it on like a saint's feast day or a religious holiday. And when they come to America, because immigrants are writing home and they're saying things like, oh, life is tough, but like, at least I get to eat meat all the time. And so industrial food doesn't quite change what meat means to people, but a special occasion food becomes an all the time food. And so taste, I don't think the taste changes fundamentally in terms of its core. So the industrial packers are trying to do two things. They're just trying to meet this huge amount of demand to allow a special occasion food to become an all-the-time food, and to make sure nobody's thinking about how the food is produced, right? They don't want people thinking about what's happening in their factories because that makes people queasy. And so all the technology is organized around those two things. It's organized around low prices and to some extent an acceptance of sanitary standards, or at least allowing people not to think about that. But I think that the core is once everyone can have that meat, people start to think in terms of the ability to eat meat is to be successful. And so a yardstick for all Americans at the time becomes whether or not they can afford meat. And so the labor movement in the United States often talks about the American worker can afford a steak and the Chinese worker lives on rice. And this is their racist way of saying, we don't want the standard of these immigrant workers from Asia. We need someone who lives on beef. And so that desire to become American by consuming beef and consuming steak, that's what the meat packers are playing into, and they're taking advantage of that by providing people what they want. And what they want is fresh, cheap beef. My belief is that in terms of the general public, thinking about how your food is produced or how any commodity produced is a very 20th century kind of thing. What mattered to people in the 19th century and early 20th century was just that they could afford this meat and it was abundant. I rarely hear them talking or thinking it through, other than fears about being poisoned by their food. And now that's not to say vegetarianism wasn't a thing. All around, there were small vegetarian societies, particularly in Britain, but some in the US. I'm of the belief that they were both building a foundation for a later story, but were marginal at the time. Now, there was also Humane Society that was humane societies in both Britain and the United States were becoming a big deal at the time. And they were pushing for reform. They didn't have a lot of success. So for instance, the Humane Society in the United States tried to give this $1,000 award if you could design a more humane cattle transport car. Because animals were transported from Kansas City to Chicago. Life was rough if you were an animal in a cattle car. Lots of injuries, animals falling down, goring each other. And they came up with these better designs that were much safer, but of course they weren't any cheaper. They were much more expensive, and it never really took off. So there is agitating around these questions, but it's not a huge deal. And I think consumers too, it is a 20th century story, really thinking about where your food comes from and how it's produced. And I think there's a lot of place for people to study how and why exactly that happened. But for the moment when industrial food came together, I think that was marginal. I think that could be up for debate. But I think that's one way we have to understand the power of industrial food is a lot of the critiques and uneasiness of it comes after the whole system is set and taken and become very powerful. The United States was a country where particularly beef, but meat in general, took on very important and specific meanings. To be successful was to eat meat regularly. That's a very American story because it emerges first in the US in the late 19th century. To be sure, it builds on a tradition that exists in Britain and elsewhere. But the idea of what I call in the book the democratization of beef, that's a very American story. And so that has emerged by, say, 1900, right? This idea that to eat beef is to be successful. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is the place of the United States in the world across the 20th century, right? The United States becomes the model. To be successful in some ways is to be American across the 20th century. And so we see the 20th century is a globalization of the American model of beef. So the US is a pioneer in this, but all over the world, a similar story starts to play out. And so this is why there are so many concerns about meat production and, say, climate change, right? The global middle class wants to eat beef along, or eat meat along, mostly along an American model. Now, of course, there's major exceptions, a place like India. But if you think about China, the Chinese middle class is eating more, particularly pork, but just more and more meat, because to eat meat is to be successful. And I would argue in some ways that story starts in America. So the US pioneers, but the rest of the world is starting to look more and more like it, and that will have major consequences. As I was writing the book, I thought a lot about the relationship between consumers and producers, as well as consumer choice, and to some extent, vegetarianism and veganism. There's a few schools of thought. One, of course, is that through our choices, we have quite a bit of power. We can actually change how an industry works. But the other says these industries are much bigger than any one of us. We're never going to voluntarily change things because they're so powerful and it's hard to get to mass adoption. I do, to some extent, buy into that idea that consumer choice is very limited in how its efficacy. And here's why. To some extent, the power of a thing like vegetarianism or veganism, or even just conscious choice about what kind of food you buy, that can be ethically good. First of all, it can say to you that you won't participate in something that you think is problematic, which to you could be very rewarding and important and very important. On the other hand, the ability to have that choice is often a kind of luxury, right? Those goods, whether ethical meat, whether certain kinds of diets, that can be more expensive. And so not everyone has the time or the money to pursue that kind of vision. And so to the extent we embrace certain kinds of consumer choices, we also have to think about a world in which more people are able to make that choice. And what that leads me to believe is, as a consumer, right, your choices don't exist in a vacuum. You have to think about how your choices are embedded and perhaps how they connect to a broader politics or broader conversation. And if you're organizing your consumer choices around starting conversations around food, around advocating for kinds of reform, then consumer politics can be very powerful. But if we imagine our choices alone are going to change how we produce our food, I don't think we're going to get very far. I think that also ties into another question, which is, I thought a lot as I was writing the book about how to change or improve the way we produce our food, even in marginal ways. And what I realized is the key feature of our food, the way we produce our meat in particular, is that it's low cost and efficient above everything else. And it comes at all sorts of environmental and human and animal costs. And so any attempt to change any of that will increase prices for consumers. And so solving the problem will also make meat more expensive. And I think that's true of industrial agriculture in general, vegetables as well. And so what we have to say then is not just what measures will make food more expensive, but also how we make people better able to afford those new kinds of food. And thinking about how our choices connect to that whole story and that politics, I think, is absolutely the key to connecting consumption and production. One of the most interesting developments of recent years, as someone who writes and thinks about meat, is this question about both plant-based meat and also lab-grown meat. Plant-based meat is already here. Lab-grown meat, depending on how optimistic we are in the next 20, 30 years, I don't know. What do we make of that? On the one level, I think this could really change the game if you're primarily concerned about animal welfare, say. And while to some extent I would bet on some of these meat alternatives, I also wouldn't bet against industrial food. In some sense, those foods are even more friendly to big industrial production, right? And again, that we were talking about this earlier, like a lot of these meat companies are reconceiving themselves as protein companies, in part because they want to be on top of. Cargill wants to be on top of lab-grown meat or plant-based meat. So that's a reason for caution. Now, I could also give you a story of a reason for optimism. And the reason for optimism is this. I've tried to argue this, and I'm still figuring it out. But I wrote this book about like industrial beef and how we should think about it and our concerns. But I'm a professor. I'm not making any money off this. I'm not going to bankrupt the big meat packers. On the other hand, you get these companies like Impossible Food, right? they are both critics of how we produce our meat, and they make money out of criticizing how we produce our meat. And that's a new thing. It used to be the skeptics or critics weren't making any money off what they were doing. Now, to some extent, natural foods and things. But as more and more companies make money off a critique of traditional food, meat production, meat producers will have to respond. Now, I don't think they're going anywhere, and I think they can rebrand, or you may discuss in this class the idea of greenwashing. But at least it's a moment where there's a conversation about where this is all going to go. And I think we're living through a really interesting moment full of possibility, as long as we're clear-eyed about the risks and thoughtful about how this fits into a bigger story. We're talking in your class, and I've been talking to you today about all these concerns about how we produce our meat. And some of you listening are thinking, I like my hamburger. And some of you are thinking, oh, you're a monster if you like your hamburger because that's murder. And I think this relates to what we were talking before about the link between consumers and producers. And I think there's a few ways we could maybe think about how we relate to our food, or at least that I've tried to implement in my life that you all might find interesting or useful. The first I would say is we should have sympathy or humility about our choices and how we relate to our food. Our dietary choices are deeply connected to who we are in terms of our identity, in terms of our upbringing, in terms of our background. None of us totally freely chose how we live. And so we have to be sympathetic to people. So if you're someone particularly concerned about meat production, maybe you're vegetarian or vegan, try to think about how you can be a good diplomat for your views. You can win people over time, because the other thing is it doesn't have to be a black and white issue. Any amount of reduction or shift in behavior affects this story. Now, the flip side of that, right? You're someone who you love your hamburger and you don't want to listen to someone saying, well, you can't eat that anymore. It makes you a bad person. You can think about how you engage with your food more in a way that makes you comfortable, but also in a way that acknowledges the reality of the problems of meat production. A lot of our challenges stem from the fact that meat is treated overwhelmingly as like a main event in our food, right? Americans eat so much meat. It's always the center of their plate, right? I think for people to continue eating meat in the future in ways that are less troubling for both the human cost, environmental, et cetera, it has to go from a main attraction to a kind of accompaniment to your meal, or a kind of infrequent, very high-end choice, like a high-end steak or something. And so just asking questions about how you relate and trying to subtly shift, telling yourself it doesn't have to be all or nothing, telling yourself you can think about different kinds of meals. And then if you're not eating meat at all, thinking about how to be a kind of diplomat for your food choices, all of that builds a world in which people relate to their food more comfortably and I think more productively. Because food is such a primal part of who we are that if we put it in too intensive a register, I think it makes the whole thing hopeless.
So let's leave things there. It's clear that how we eat animals, whether we do it at all, if we do it, how we do it, that represents one of the most potent sites where we can articulate a vision of food politics in our daily lives. Questions of ethics, of labor, and the environment, they all come to the fore in the decisions that we make about our plates. And at the same time, we've got to confront the degree to which our own personal decisions are actually able to influence larger systems, on their own or maybe in tandem with regulation and others' choices. We're going to come back to that really soon, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.